Hi and welcome to this next video. As part of Haxby and Wigginton Methodist Church's exploring of a Methodist way of life, we focus on service, one of the four priorities of the Methodist Church, and a priority unpacked for us in three commitments that we look on, we reflect on as we think about what it means to follow Jesus in service. Today we're going to spend some time with a story in Luke's Gospel of Jesus' encounter with a man called Zacchaeus, a man who's curious, a man who comes along and climbs a tree. It says that he was rather small, which is why he climbed the tree. I think there are lots of good reasons for climbing trees, even if you're not small. But he comes along and Jesus immediately calls him out of the tree and has a conversation with him. And Zacchaeus has what some would consider a change of heart in this moment. So we'll get to the story in a bit. But first, just to think about our commitment to what service means. The Methodist way of life focus of service. I begin with the assumption that if you're in the congregation that I serve in Haxby and Wigginton, whoever you are, I begin with the assumption that we all want to help other people. None of us needs, I'm sure, to be convinced that it is good and right and even desirable to be of use, to be helpful to other people, to serve in some way. And the commitments that are part of this aspect of our Methodist Church's life are these, and there are three of them, as there have been in each of the other focuses so far. We help people in our communities and beyond. We care for creation and all God's gifts, and we challenge injustice. We help people in our communities and beyond. We care for creation and all God's gifts. We challenge injustice. I guess when we think about what it means to help people in our communities and beyond, the question for us is, who do we help? And who do we not help? And how do we decide? There are limitations to what we can do, and that question, those series of questions can be quite vexing for us, quite challenging. And I guess that's where I think the discipleship work for us is really. The work of asking what it means to be Christ-like means more than just those questions, but exploring where they come from inside of us. But it's not whether we help, it's who we help and who we don't. What is there to learn about not just the limited resources we might have, but also about ourselves in the process? Who do we think is more or less deserving, and why? It's no accident that the World Wildlife Fund have a panda bear on the logo, because pandas are cute and cuddly, aren't they? And I saw a comment by someone once saying, what if the WWF had used a blobfish? You may never have seen a blobfish, so I want to show you a blobfish. That's a blobfish. Not the most thrilling animal to look at. It looks a bit like a lump of snot with a nose and a fin at the back. It really is an ugly animal. Some people say it's the ugliest animal in the world. Well, that's a bit unfair. But why is it that the WWF have chosen to have a panda bear? Well, partly because it is symbolic of many things, but we see the same affinity at play in all kinds of ways. We value or choose how we value different animals, different moments, different situations, different conflicts. And I want to say honestly that from February onwards, we saw that in ourselves with the war in Ukraine, how much it felt. And I want to say this honestly, I think for most of us, it felt like something that was about people like us. And so it moved us more than conflicts in other places, like the Horn of Africa, or parts of the Middle East, or Asia, or elsewhere. Because it might not have felt that they were in some ways about people who were quite like us in the same way. So the questions are there for us. It's not just who do we help. What is there for us to learn as we reflect on that? And then in our own church, we've been banging the drum, the care of creation drum for a long time, and rightly so. And we need to continue doing that. Our planet is in a dangerous state, certainly for us as human beings. We know that the earth has been through all kinds of momentous upheaval in the past, and it recovers and it flourishes and brings new diversity. But for us as human beings who are causing so much of the current destruction, in the way that we're treating it, and in our own vested interest in what it means to survive, those questions are there for us. And again, I don't make the assumption that you need to be told in any way that there are choices that we need to make about caring for creation. You know that. So perhaps the question for all of us as we reflect on this as part of our discipleship is, when does convenience or inconvenience come into play? How are we making choices that go beyond what is convenient for us, or what helps us to feel as though we are making a difference, however small, but leaving our lives and lifestyles essentially intact as they are? Those questions are there for us. And then there is that third commitment. We challenge injustice. That's where I think the Zacchaeus story is a really helpful story. So often when we read the story, we think of it as a story about repentance and change of heart, and Zacchaeus is the focus. Jesus is in town. Zacchaeus is curious. He climbs the tree, and he encounters Jesus in a conversation. And he's so moved by his welcome that he repents of his, we assume, fraudulent behavior as a tax collector, as an officer of the state, of the occupying force. And he says that he will give away half of all he has and repay and more. And then Jesus says, salvation is here. But maybe, just maybe, it's a different story as well. Maybe it's a different story first. And maybe there are clues in that when we look at what Jesus does in the story. Perhaps this is a story about injustice, and in some ways, maybe it's about the injustice not that Zacchaeus is perpetrating, we assume, but the injustice that is being done to Zacchaeus. See, he's an easy person to put into a pigeonhole, to put into a box. He's a tax collector. He has sided with the state. He's defrauding people. He's not trustworthy. He's clearly a man who needs salvation. But maybe this is a story about demonization, and the way that it's so convenient for us so often to look at the lives of some people as a way of ignoring the need to look at our own. It's a story about the neglect of our own compromises, because Jesus engages in this way in other places too. You remember him, the story with a woman caught in adultery. What does he do? He says to the crowd who want to stone her to death, well, whichever one of you has not sinned, you can be the first to throw a stone. And what a mature crowd, that they realize what he said. They recognize that they are complicit in demonizing this woman, and they walk away. You see, Jesus takes the initiative. He's in whatever the situation is. We're not quite sure. He's in this moment, and he sees Zacchaeus and says, Zacchaeus, come down out of the tree. But let's notice what he says to him. And if you need the story, it's in Luke chapter 19, the beginning, verses 1 to 10. He doesn't say to him, I want to have a conversation with you about your morals, or your practice, or your betrayal of the Jewish people. He says, Zacchaeus, come down out of the tree, because I'm coming home with you for lunch. Now again, it's important to point out that this scandal, one of the central scandals of Jesus in the way that he goes about being Jesus, is that he sits and eats with anyone. He doesn't pay attention to the rules about where you sit, or how you wash, or where your place is, or who's included, or whether a woman can be present or not. One of the great scandals of the life of Jesus is what he does, breaking bread with people. It's not so much the Holy Communion that is the great invitation moment. There's story after story all the way through of him scandalizing the religious sensibilities of his day by his desire to sit and eat with people. He doesn't start a conversation with Zacchaeus about his conduct or his faith or his lack of justice. He just says, I'm coming home with you. I'm coming home for lunch. When I was a boy in South Africa, my friends and I played games. One of my friends, his family had built a house on a new estate, and opposite their house there was a big open field, just an empty field. We used to love that field. We would run into that field, and we would play in that field, and we would play cowboys and Indians. We would play cops and robbers, goodies and baddies in various forms. And when you're 7 or 8 or 10 years old, that's right. That's how the world works. It is that simple. In some ways, it's understandable at that age that you separate the world so easily and so conveniently into the people who are good and the people who are not. But maybe the Zacchaeus story is asking us whether we're involved in a simplistic categorization of people, even as we read the story. Maybe even as we think about these commitments and who they're actually about. Zacchaeus is not the victim in any way. In our traditional reading of the story, he is the perpetrator of injustice in our minds. But just maybe the situation for a first century small Palestinian man, in terms of his ability to do physical labor amongst other things, and the fact of needing to put food on the plates of his children and his family, maybe the complexity of life, as it is for all of us, leads him to the only choice he can make in some ways, which is to become what he becomes. He's perhaps not strong, and so he becomes a tax collector and must climb a tree and be on the outside. Maybe Jesus is the only person who sees that complexity, who looks through the obvious labels that are written large across his life in the way we read the story, and who sees the human being, sees Zacchaeus as a victim of the simplistic separation of goodies and baddies in his own community, so that who he is and what it means for him to be Jewish and to be part of that community's life is being denied to him because others have decided who he is and what he's like and what he deserves and what he doesn't. So the story is a story about inclusion. It's a story about complexity. It is a story about restitution. And we think as we read it normally that the restitution is about Zacchaeus emptying his pockets and recompensing all who have been cheated or treated unfairly in the way he's gone about this. I mean, let's just start by saying who knows what pressure he had from above within a system that must have had its share of corruption. And there's no excusing his behavior, of course, if that's what it was. And we think that's the restitution that this is about. And that's what unlocks Jesus saying salvation has come to this house. That old trope of us needing to be sufficiently humble, abjectly sorry for ourselves before God will love us. But that's not the gospel. That is not the gospel. That is not the good news demonstrated by Jesus in this story, never mind in other places through Scripture. Perhaps this is a story about Jesus restoring Zacchaeus. Because what does the crowd do? Well, they start grumbling. He's here with all of us. We know what we're like. We know what he's like. And he's going to have lunch with him. We see what's at play. Zacchaeus is as much victim as he may be perpetrator. So maybe the restitution, maybe the restoring is for Zacchaeus, not for those whom he may owe some money to, because Jesus sees the complexity of his situation. Jesus sees the humanity of the man in the tree, and Jesus says to him, I want to be part of your life, where you are at home. I want to be a guest in your life. Jesus doesn't say to him, come down out the tree and let's have a conversation about all the things in your life that must be different before you are lovable or welcome. Or let me make an example of you in front of all these other good people. It's not what happens. This is a story about relationship and God desiring relationship. And perhaps it is a necessary story for us as we think about what it means to challenge injustice, what it means to serve those in our communities and beyond, what it means to take care of the world in which we live. Perhaps again, like with the other commitments that are part of exploring what it means to follow Jesus, as we use these words that are part of a Methodist way of life, maybe this story is really important for us. Because whoever you are, and thank you for watching this much and this far, I'm sure that you don't need to be told that there are people who need help. You don't need to be encouraged to help people because you are a good person. You don't need to be told that the world needs looking after and that there are choices for you to make, as there are for me and for all of us, because you are a good person. And you don't need to be told that it's important for you to stand up for others who can't stand up for themselves or who need allies, and try to make the world a fairer place, because you are a good person. But in every one of those acts of service, those choices that we make, there are questions for us that are part of the Zacchaeus story. Who do we not help? Or why, maybe to phrase it differently, why do we feel so inclined to help some situations so powerfully and others almost not at all? Yes, it is true that God sometimes moves us within, to strong emotion that points us in certain directions. But there's more going on than that. What is there to learn about ourselves in that process? The question for us is not, do we do enough recycling, or do we care for creation enough, but when are we willing to be interrupted, as in other stories in Scripture? Because the gospel is just brilliant at inconveniencing us, pulling up a handbrake on the assumptions we make about who we are and what we do and what's right and wrong. When does care of creation inconvenience us? How do we choose that? And when it comes to this question of injustice, well, it can be overwhelming to think, how does little me make any difference to the mess that this world is in? How do I begin to speak up for those who have little voice? How do I begin to make a difference? Does writing a letter to a member of parliament make any difference at all? Does signing a petition online or in other ways make any difference at all? Does going on a march make any difference at all? It all feels so powerless in so many ways. So maybe a really important part of asking what these commitments ask of us, maybe the Zacchaeus story asks us, as part of our reflecting on what it means to challenge injustice, to think about the unlearning of that all of us should be engaged in throughout our lives, where the gospel asks us to see the complexity of situations, to be much, much slower to make snap decisions about who is right and wrong, about who the goody is and who the baddie is. See, Zacchaeus is not treated in any way by Jesus as a bad person, an undeserving person, or an unworthy person. Something in the way that Jesus treats Zacchaeus and his humanity and his exclusion opens his heart to be part of his community again and make restitution where he needs to. Do you notice in closing that Zacchaeus doesn't even begin there? Doesn't begin with a confession. Our reading of the story is so coloured by the dominant narrative of it that we miss the fact that Zacchaeus doesn't really make a confession of his wrongs. He says he will give away half of what he has to those who are poorest, which is an interesting choice, because if you want to win back your place in society, you usually would give that money to those who are powerful. And he says, if I have wronged anyone, I will give back 4 times what I've taken. He will make restitution with great generosity. So you will know, if you're part of our church's life, that for each of these focuses and for each of the commitments that are part of them, there are some focus cards in our church with 3 or 4 or 5 things that you can try to do, you can do as part of practicing each of these commitments. But as we think about service, there are deeper questions for us beyond who do we serve, and beyond what do we do for the world, and beyond how do we challenge injustice, beyond the practice questions. But what is there in us which is still needing to become more Christ-like in the Jesus we meet in this story as he encounters Zacchaeus? I know that question is real for me, and I'm sure that it's real for you as well, because all of us have the joy and the task and the work and the inconvenience of having the gospel interrupt our assumptions and undo some of the lopsided foundations we've been given again and again and again. And maybe as we think about what it means to serve others, what it means to care for the world, and what it means to help the world be a more just place. Yes, of course, what do we do? But perhaps beneath that, why do we value what we value? Why do we care for what we care for? Who is needing to climb a tree on the outside of our lives to look in to what we think is at the center? And how willing are we to be inconvenienced in our, not just practice, but our assumptions and our unlearning and our traveling with all of the easy ways in which we have allowed ourselves to, or ourselves taken part in, or just accepted and inherited the lopsided, skewed values of a world that is very quick to have us decide that some things and some people and some issues matter more than others. So bless you as you journey on. And there'll be other videos as part of exploring the series, and I hope to have a conversation with a few folk as well about these aspects of service and how they challenge and impact their lives. This video is a little late because I was on holiday, and so the next one or two might also be a little bit delayed, but they'll be there for you to use now or in the future if you'd like to. And bless you as you do, as we explore what it means to follow Jesus today with a Methodist flavour, using these words, these commitments, and letting them ask as many questions of us as we ask of them. Take care.